The card we're looking at now, in New Age decks, is called the Magician, but in the older French decks it's usually called le Bateleur, meaning street juggler or conjurer. Whereas the Waite-Smith Magician is a priestly figure pointing the wand in his right hand at the sky and the forefinger of his left at the ground, the Tarot de Marseille's Bateleur retains the gaiety and colourful garb of the earlier Fool, as would befit a street entertainer, which his name suggests he is. The Waite-Smith Magician is an altogether more serious figure, standing at a table in a grove of roses and lilies. Above his head is a halo, like a horizontal number 8, and around his waist is a belt, fashioned to look like an Uroboros, a snake eating its own tail. The halo, Waite tells us, is a symbol of life, though it's also commonly used as a symbol of infinity. The Uroboros, a symbol found frequently in emblematic alchemical images, is a symbol of nature considered as an eternity of cyclical becoming, whereby nature perpetuates herself by consuming herself. When nature is understood in this way, she herself is seen as divinity and is traditionally worshipped and treated as such. It's references of this kind, alongside traditional Christian symbolism, which we'll look at later, that made the Waite-Smith Tarot a platform for the later New Age movement's spiritual monism or oneism to step out from. Waite himself insists that with this card as its context, the Uroboros here symbolises not just eternity in general, but the eternity of attainment in the spirit. He clearly considers this card to be of great spiritual import and has designed his own version of it to communicate this. He describes his magician's hand gestures as a mystical sign that shows the descent of grace, virtue, and light drawn from things above and derived to things below. He goes on, "The suggestion throughout is therefore the possession and communication of the powers and gifts of the Spirit, which terms in print he capitalizes to proclaim their divine patrimony. That Waite appropriates the Uroboros to symbolize attainment of the Spirit does beg the question as to precisely how he conceives of divinity, since in the Christian and Old Testament traditions, the Uroboric conception of divinity is considered to be a pagan one, in essence idolatrous and incompatible with biblical monotheism. In biblical monotheism, it's in God's very nature to exist, and he has no need to eternally consume himself in order to endure. Guided by the certainty of God's inherent self-sufficiency, the Bible's creation accounts summarily dismissed the various foundations of polytheistic religion with startling brevity. With the benefit of the hindsight afforded to us by biblical monotheism's triumphal revolution against polytheistic paganism, we can see that the serpent eating its own tail is suggested by the actual life cycle of snakes, which periodically shed their skin so that a renewed body appears to be emerging out of the old one. The monthly waxing and waning of the moon offers another symbol of cyclical renewal, reified into a divine principle by polytheistic religions, but dethroned and dismissed in the first 3 chapters of Genesis, the first book of the Bible. Here, the 4 elements symbolize nothing but themselves and are ordered not by a separate deity, but by the one who created them. Water is not a symbol of deified chaos, but is just water, initially part of the formless waste that God uses to form our cosmos. The sun, the moon, and the stars are no more than lights set in the sky, put there to provide light for living creatures and to separate day from night. Later, the serpent is presented as a powerful, mischievous creature, but a creature nonetheless, infinitely subordinate to his creator, the one and only true God. In this metaphysical cosmology, the Uroboros could only ever be a symbol of created nature, void of any genuine eternity. But in keeping with the symbolic polemicism of the biblical creation accounts, it's considered too mischievous to even be granted that humble role. Instead, it's identified with the archetypal spirit of evil and condemned to perpetual enmity with humankind. The antiquity and universality of the Uroboros is evidenced not only by the serpent's appearance in the biblical story of Adam's and Eve's banishment from the Garden of Eden, but also in the story of the Buddha's enlightenment 500 years before the birth of Christ. It's a conception of eternity of a type that held sway in the Mesopotamian religions that Canaanite religious culture evolved from. In the form of a dragon, it's encountered in religious mythologies as far apart as those held by ancient Britons and the dynastic Chinese. Yet it's no more than a source of temptation, of disordered desire in the biblical tradition. Waite seems attracted to it, but at the same time, he tries throughout his deck to preserve a memory of the Judeo-Christian world, which perhaps is a tribute to the esteem in which he still held it in his explorations of mysticism. If we turn to the Bateleur of the Tarot de Marseille, his very humbleness seems more consistent with the Catholic worldview that becomes so evident in later cards, yet it is still an image presented to us for an archetypal purpose and related to the unnumbered fool who acts as the foundation of all the tarot trump cards, including this one. The Bateleur, I think, is a response to the fool's lack of accomplishment that limits his engagement with the world, in contrast to the comparatively portentous agency of the Waite magician in his mastery of the four estates of society laid out on his altar-like table. The Batelleur's table is strewn with a nondescript collection of materials that appear to have no particular significance. If the wand he holds in his left hand signifies anything, it is the power of individual agency, so magical to the childlike consciousness of the fool, which now explores its own powers in the world of manipulable things. There's a link between this agency and the hat that the Bateleur is wearing, the rim of which has the same configuration as Waite's symbol of life or infinity, the selfsame infinity that the fool is absorbed in, possibly to his own detriment. If we turn to the unnumbered, unnamed Visconti Sforza version of this card, we see on his table what Cristina d'Orsini, the deck's publisher, tells us is a noted cheese of the period known to be produced for the Sforza family. This adds a specificity to the image that allows us to perceive the figure as engaged in a particular type of industry, which resonates with the equivalent card in the Mantegna Tarot known as the Artisan. The Mantegna artisan, with his furnace blazing, appears to be a metal worker equipped with a range of tools needed for carrying out careful, precise work. In these older decks, then, the principle communicated ranges from the absorbed playfulness of the Bateleur to the skilled craftwork of the Visconti Sforza's cheesemaker and the Mantegna's artisan. I pointed out previously that the Mantegna Tarot has a different structure to what became the convention in later tarot cards. It has 50 rather than 22 trump cards and no suit or pip cards. The 50 trumps are divided into 5 decades, each illustrating a particular theme deemed necessary for the attainment of the card's ultimate end. Since the last two cards are the prime mover and the prime cause, both attributes of God as creator, it's quite obvious that these cards represent and commend a moral spiritual path. And since, as with conventional tarot decks, the Pope and a Christian emperor are included before later references to classical Roman and Greek themes associated with Platonism, Neoplatonism and Hermeticism, what we're seeing here in these decks is an attempt by Renaissance and early modern Catholic culture to assimilate the virtues of classical antiquity. In the Mantegna deck, between Misero and the artisan is an intermediary card called Fameo, who Dorsini tells us is a servant. This is entirely fitting, since in order to break out of the perfect self-absorption that typifies the fool's and the infant's consciousness, we must sacrifice that perfection and recognize our need to learn how to communicate with others and accommodate their needs, an accommodation perfectly captured in this symbol of service. Only in this way can we learn artisanal skills from others.